The APUSH teachers created a podcast to model our end-of-the-year project. The podcast project emphasizes a specific civic theme. In this case, that theme is the role and power of the federal government. More specifically, we ask, and hopefully answer, the question, how has the role of the federal government, specifically in regard to internal improvements, been a point of debate throughout U.S. history? Check in Google Classroom for a copy of this script and the bibliography. We hope you enjoy the discussion and that it serves as a good baseline for your group to create their podcast.
Hello, APUSH Nation, and welcome to the podcast. This is Mr. O'Hagan, and I'm joined by
Mr. Zagari
and
Mrs. Capito.
You know, I was on the White House website the other day. I know I'm so cool, checking out the White House website randomly.
Who isn't?
Yeah. And I noticed a detailed post about President Biden's $1.2 trillion Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA for short. You know, the post showed a graphic of the major construction projects and repairs that are going to be made everywhere from the Hudson River to the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco over the next 10 or 20 years.
You know, I've been trying to keep up, especially on that Hudson River project that's going on, mostly because it's local to us. But it seems that there's a lot of debate going on over who's paying for it and the magnitude of the job that's going to be done to build another tunnel and the sharing between Amtrak, New Jersey Transit, and who has control over that massive project under the Hudson River to make the flow of traffic into the Northeast Corridor a little bit more easier.
Yeah, it's very ambitious, no doubt about that.
I think also part of the issue there for lots of people is how long is this project going to take? Like, we're spending all of this money and projecting, this is not going to even be finished or come into effect for years down the line. I think that's a lot of people have apprehension about these major projects because of that as well.
You mentioned that apprehension, and I think that's a pretty good place for us to transition here because there's been significant pushback in some circles. GOP Representative Tom Emmer of Minnesota released a statement back in October slamming the passage of the infrastructure bill, arguing that it, quote, lays the groundwork for passage of President Biden's multi-trillion-dollar socialist wish list, unquote. You know, and that's when it jumped out at me that this internal improvement question has really been a point of debate throughout U.S. history and centers on a basic civic theme about the role of the federal government, federalism, the power of the states, and especially all of this in regard to internal improvements. You know, it made me think that these current debates kind of remind me of things of the past. Mr. Zagari, do you have an early example of this debate?
Well, of course, you know, when I'm thinking about these early debates over the role of the federal government and federalism and the power of states, I'm going to Hamilton. And yeah, that's where I'm going. And of course, you know, Hamilton was a major proponent of expanding federal power. We know that his financial system, including the Bank of the United States, or as we like to call it, the BUS, was designed to give the central government more of a role in moving the American economy from its agricultural character to a more competitive eve of the 19th century industrial economy. He was convinced that infrastructure was key to the growth and saw federal tariffs as a way to fund that infrastructure. Listen to this quote from his 1791 report on manufacturers. Quote, good roads, canals, and navigable rivers, by diminishing the expense of carriage, put the remote parts of a country more nearly upon a level with those in the neighborhood of the town. They are upon that account of the greatest of all improvements, close quote. And let's not forget that, you know, one of Hamilton's earliest industrial projects was the Society of Urban Manufacturers along the Passaic River in Patterson, New Jersey.
How could we ever forget that?
I gotta plug the homeland there.
Yes, you do.
You know, but you know, and who's Hamilton quoting here? He's quoting Adam Smith. And arguing that the tariff would pay for all of these improvements. He's using the tariff to pay for these infrastructure improvements to better the republic. Remember, he's coming from that continental thinking, not coming from the mind of just a New Yorker in this case. And his infrastructure funded by the federal government? Yes, please, said Hamilton. Just like President Biden is saying yes. So Hamilton got his wish? Well,
yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. I mean, not so much, I guess, right? I mean, because he certainly isn't going to find himself with a lot of political support once the Federalists find themselves out of office.
That's very true. When his frenemy Jefferson comes into power, the Republicans, they take a very different approach. Now let's remember that Jefferson is a staunch anti-federalist. He supports small government and a society of small independent farmers where the government really takes a backseat approach. A great example of this would be the Erie Canal Project. In the great Erie Canal Project of the 1800s, various New York politicians and businessmen were working really hard to try to secure some federal funding for a man-made waterway upstate New York that would stretch all the way from the Hudson River to the Great Lakes. But politically, the climate had certainly changed. When he was approached with the plan for the Erie Canal in the early 1800s, then President Thomas Jefferson said said plan was a little short of madness, and he completely rejected it. He didn't think it could be built, nor did he think that the federal government should have any role in it. But we know that New Yorkers, ever persistent and kind of pains in the butts, continued to work to obtain federal support. They finally succeeded in 1817 when Congress appropriated funds. But on his last full day in office, President Madison vetoed the so-called bonus bill.
Oh, Madison.
I know. Remember,
Virginia.
Madison said that a canal was a good idea, but he explained that he was constrained by the insuperable difficulty he felt in reconciling the bill with the Constitution of the United States. Essentially, he felt like the Constitution didn't support that. The power of funding internal improvements is not expressly given by the Constitution, and he refused to gauge an inadmissible latitude of construction.
So, no canal?
No, the canal was definitely built, but not with federal help. Now, DeWitt Clinton, the governor of the great state of New York at that time, eventually secured the funding, but that was not an easy push. It got the nickname DeWitt Clinton's Ditch. People thought it was going to be an epic failure, but he did get the support from the New York legislature and private investors. The canal was built and finally opened in 1825. Remember when they poured that ceremonial bucket of Lake Erie water and it was poured into the New York Harbor?
Who could forget
I know,
that?
clearly,
It was
a watershed moment.
A watershed.
Shed.
I got that. Nice.
Oh,
I know.
harumph.
Well done.
So a victory for the Jeffersonians and their next generation successors, the Jacksonians, who had picked up that small government mantle from Thomas Jefferson. Why a victory, you ask? Because the improvements happened, but under the auspices of the state and not the federal government. Remember, today's Republicans, like Tom Emmer of Minnesota, they would undoubtedly point to this as proof that you don't need big government to get things done. And that's what Jefferson argued the whole time. If you give people the power, the ingenuity, and the freedom to do it, they can get it done. He didn't believe the federal government needed to be involved.
So that's it then. Only states, only state-built improvements after that?
Well, not quite. You got to remember, we start to drift back in the mid-1840s to Hamilton and the Federalists with the Transcontinental Railroad.
Ah, yes, my
Yeah.
favorite.
So in 1845, the New York entrepreneur Asa Whitney went to Congress proposing the federal funding of a railroad that would stretch to the Pacific. Lobbying efforts over the next several years failed due to growing sectionalism in Congress. We have to remember that all of those diehard states' rights slavery guys wouldn't have been big supporters of encouraging federal power. But by 1860, a young engineer named Theodore Judah identified the infamous Donner Pass in Northern California as an ideal location for constructing a railroad through the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains.
Wonder what they had for dinner.
Oh, man, we all remember the Donner Party.
Yeah, just going to roll over all those skeletons there.
Well, by 1861, Judah had enlisted a group of investors in Sacramento to form the Central Pacific Railroad Company. He then headed to Washington, where he was able to convince congressional leaders to pass the bill.
Which is no small feat because he had the nickname Crazy Judah. People thought he wasn't going to be able to get it done and he would never get the bill passed.
So true, and one of the reasons he's able to get it passed is because all of those states' rights-minded Southerners by 1861 had seceded from the Union, so the only people left in Congress were more moderate, federally supportive Northern legislators, and that's what gets that bill passed. So when Lincoln eventually signs the Pacific Railroad Act into law in 1862, the Republicans then kind of become the representative of a much more favorable, federally led improvement which really rules the day. Republicans, you have to remember, by this point, are Lincoln's Republicans, and they're truly more the political descendants of Hamilton's Federalists and even Henry Clay's Whigs from the 1830s and 1840s. You know, that Transcontinental Railroad, it completely remade America, and it reasserted a much more ambitious role for the federal government in these kinds of improvements. So, kind of the anti-Erie Canal in that regard, right?
So the federal government is back, and now it's going to take the lead again on all the big projects to follow?
Well, a timeout. You know, we don't have enough time to talk about everything else that follows in American history, but let's look at some of those, you know, some of those big projects that do follow. What about the Brooklyn Bridge? Would we say that that's a federally supported project? No, that's really kind of
local.
It's
municipal.
local, municipal. Again, probably looks more like the Erie Canal, which is more private investment than anything else. But you did have the New York City Board of Aldermen who participated in it. But that's not a federally funded project. What about the New Deal?
You know, that's a major commitment to federally funded and federally organized internal improvements. I mean, look at what the New Deal did. It put people back to work on the dime of the federal government, putting infrastructure in. TVA is one of the first thing that comes to my mind of infrastructure. It's electrifying the South.
Right.
It's flood control of the South. It is infrastructure all the way.
And that one's much more long term. If you think of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, or the Public Works Administration, even think of the completion of the Hoover Dam, which was actually started under the Hoover administration, but finished as part of the New Deal. That's all infrastructure. I think the only thing that, you know, requires a little bit of an asterisk there is that it's in the middle of the Depression, so it is kind of an extraordinary circumstance, but clearly it's federally driven more than anything else.
Absolutely. We can't forget Eisenhower's Interstate Highway Program, which completely revolutionized the nation. And that was a complete federal commitment to building an infrastructure, highway, mass transit.
And that really follows on the heels of the New Deal. It's much more kind of in key, although Eisenhower was a Republican and identified himself as that modern Republican, which basically meant that he wasn't looking to expand New Deal programs, but he was going to let what already existed stay in place. I think this shows that even among those modern Republicans, there was a pretty willing acceptance that the federal government, when there was a big project to be had and to be completed, the federal government was going to play a role in it. And certainly for Eisenhower, there were more than just infrastructure concerns. There were national security,
military movements,
mobilization of the defense during the Cold War.
Really driven by Cold War concerns as much as anything else. But again, back to our theme, it's federally driven, right?
Yep.
What about the Big Dig in Boston? What do you guys think about that one or know about that one as more of a modern example?
You know, what I've heard about the Big Dig of this, you know, the tunneling system in Boston, like, this is looking at a 60-40 split between the federal government and the state government.
And maybe for some of our listeners, they might not be aware of what the Big Dig is. What is the Big Dig? Because I don't know what the Big Dig is.
So the Big Dig was a tunnel project that was supposed to alleviate a lot of the concerns into Boston and just make the entire conduit into Boston a much more hospitable drive. I think
the builders were called groundhogs, that were actually the construction workers actually doing the work itself because of all the time that they spent underground digging this tunnel that went through Boston, under Boston Harbor, to just as like I want to say almost like as a safety valve of sorts of alleviating traffic in and around the city.
Yeah, and I don't remember. I think it was started in the late 90s and it wasn't completed until
I want to say within the
last 10.
Yeah,
right?
Maybe,
I was going to say maybe 2012, 2013. So it was close to 15 years that it was going on. But again, for our theme, you have what now seems to be more of a cooperative effort between federal government and state government. The 60-40 split was 60% obligation and responsibility on the federal government's part. 40% of the money came from the states. So I wonder, is that the future of 21st century infrastructure?
You know, I think you might be onto something there, Mr. O'Hagan, because I know that's been in discussion with the Hudson River project, and I know because Amtrak is partially federally funded, that could be a role in that too. But you know, if you think about it, if we're going this route, if the federal government and the state governments are looking to partner in splitting costs, well then how is that going to carry over when this infrastructure is going to need maintenance and upkeep. Who is going to be footing the bill for that, and who's going to be doing the work for that? And is this going to be a long-term commitment by both agencies and the private sector as well? I think these are all questions that are going to have to be answered, and possibly a shift in our in these payment processes of these two groups.
So what do you think we need to learn from this discussion? How has this civic issue really impacted American society?
I think if we look at both of these, if we look at the Erie Canal project or we look at the Transcontinental Railroad, both of those completely transformed the country. The Erie Canal transformed the economy. It led to, the prices for goods, manufactured goods dropped by 90%.
Right.
Even upstate, most towns and cities live very close to the original Erie Canal. It transformed New York into the most important hub of international and domestic trade for the U.S. And certainly the Transcontinental Railroad leading to the settlement of the West and really the closing of the West ultimately as well.
And I find this, so fascinating that it doesn't matter if you're, a Henry Clay advocate Whig promoting the American system, or an advocate promoting Joe Biden's Democratic Party infrastructure bill. You're still having the same, fundamental debate over who's paying for it.
Absolutely. It's all about the Benjamins. It comes down to the money.
Where's it coming from?
Right, and that kind of leads us right into my next question, which is this a continuity or change, this civic issue? Is this issue of the role of the federal government in federalism and the power of states, regarding internal improvements, is it a continuity? Is it a change in history?
I would argue that the fundamental question is a continuity. I think that we see these continuities, whether it's the Erie Canal, the Transcontinental Railroad, the interstate highway system, Boston's Big Dig, whatever the case may be.
It's the same debate.
It's the same debate. Yeah. I think maybe the change, you could argue that with Boston's Big Dig, you got a 60-40 split. Okay, so now you're starting to see more of a negotiation between the states, the federal, and maybe the private sector.
It's kind of ironic because we tend to think of ourselves in being in an era where, the political parties can't get together on anything and there isn't any cooperation. So who knows, maybe this is a good sign. Maybe this is an example of somewhere where it could work. Well, I think that's all the time we have. You can find the script for this podcast and the accompanying bibliography posted on Google Classroom. Thanks for joining us for this special conversation. We're looking forward to listening to your podcast. Good luck, Godspeed, and may the force be with you.